Welcome to Lead Wisely by WonderTour. Let's start with a tough question about leadership. Brian, we're looking at the movie Iron Man. And one of the things that sticks out to me right from the beginning is Tony Stark really a leader in this movie? I'd love to hear your perspective.
No, that is a great question. It was fun revisiting this movie after a while, one of the canonical pieces of the Marvel history. This is a great movie. It's a lot of fun. Tony has a lot of really great characteristics in this movie, right? He is brilliant with technology and with inventing solutions to his problems. He has a curious mindset. He's exploring the boundaries of what's possible. He runs a bunch of really great experiments. He's got a really wonderful sense of research and development about how to iterate your way to building up technology into better and better things and bootstrapping your way into something that works really well. Like the dojo that he's built for himself in multiple contexts in this movie is great. He's got a lot of admirable characteristics. I would argue, in context of the magnanimous leader concept that we've been developing over the course of the WonderTour podcasts and videos, no, he's not a leader. He's certainly, in the course of this movie, arguably becomes a hero, maybe to the Luke Skywalker level of being a hero. But he doesn't display any of the characteristics of a leader. Certainly at the beginning of the movie, and even by the end, when we talk about leadership, we talk about the superpower of vision, of having a purpose and aligning actions toward that purpose that is larger than yourself. We talk about the superpower of nurturing, about taking care of other people, about helping them grow, about helping them achieve their potential. We talk about the superpower of compassion, about caring about the vision and about the others more than you care about yourself, to the extent that you're willing to take actions that don't necessarily benefit you. Whether it's the Obi-Wan or Gandalf sacrifice, or whether it's just the hard work every day of doing things that are not for your own glory. And at the start of this movie, Tony has none of those things. His vision is arguably inherited from his father blindly. Like, we build weapons because that's what we do. And I'm really good at building weapons, and building weapons must be a good thing, right? And we see him routinely ignoring and belittling and abusing all of the people around him for his own amusement. And we don't see him ever do anything that he doesn't want to
do. Yeah, even the way that he runs his company, we never see him leading anybody. It's always, in fact, that he is being led by somebody. He just happens to be the heir to the company. He happens to be the lead tech, the lead architect, engineer, whatever, right? He's the guy who develops all of the different technology and pushes them forward. He's the ideas guy, but he's never the guy who's actually leading anybody. I would argue that what we instead see is he is pretty heavily led around by Potts, and certainly he is being led by Obi. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in ensuing sections, but I don't know how much he realizes that. I think perhaps he's okay with some aspects of it, and because he's just here to have fun, here to create cool stuff, here to enjoy his life. But in other ways, I don't even know that he knows that that's happening. I think that it's easy to fall into the trap, if you're Tony, of thinking that you are running your company, where maybe let's contrast that to Bruce Wayne or to Batman. And specifically, if we look at the Nolan movies, because that's what we love to talk about, Chris Nolan on WonderTour. So if we look at that, Bruce Wayne, Batman really becomes his persona by the end of the trilogy. He doesn't want to be Bruce Wayne anymore. He shirks his responsibilities to Wayne Enterprises. He is completely absent. He turns over it to Fox, which eventually even that falls apart by the third movie. And yet, I think you could argue that his character arc, he becomes a leader during the first movie. While he is making sacrifices, while he is trying to atone for the sins of his family, much like Tony is doing, he isn't just out there doing things because it's cool or for himself. He's out there doing things because he sees people who are in need, who need his help. That's why he's doing it. And so we see some of those traits like you were talking about, Brian, like compassion and integrity and things like that Tony doesn't really exhibit yet. He will later. but Bruce exhibits those earlier on. So again, just it's fun to compare and contrast Luke Skywalker to Tony Stark to Bruce
Yes, the
Wayne.
the DC versus Marvel billionaire tech enabled superhero playboy is pretty easy, right? You're absolutely right. Yeah, and that's actually a really good way of looking at it. Is I think that Tony throughout this movie, even by the end, we never really see him enabling anybody else. We never really see him training anybody else. We never see him, even to the extent that he is able to have some self sacrifice. It's in the service of cleaning up his own messes, right? He sort of incidentally helps some oppressed people, but that's not why he's there. Like he didn't go there for them. He went there for himself, right? And it's because of the mess that he's made, right? So he's starting to take responsibility, and he certainly is becoming. He's portrayed as becoming heroic in the process. But I think it's interesting that he's in charge of this giant technology company, and he's this brilliant inventor, and we never see him interacting with any other humans in that context, right? Like he's got a couple things where he's like, "Hey, Pepper, can you come hold this one thing? Come plug this thing into my chest," right? But it's just him and his robots. When his mentor, betrayed father figure is trying to recreate the arc reactor with the other engineers from Stark, it's evident that they've never talked to him. He's never trained them. These other people that are engineers in his own company have not learned anything from him. He hasn't passed on any knowledge or any expertise. They can't even come close to duplicating something that he did, in a week in a cave in this context, right? Lots of fun superhero movie things going on here, but the way he's portrayed is very much of the rogue genius, and that's very different from the kind of leadership persona and skill set impact on the world that we're trying to craft, that we're talking about as the successful. And a lot of the problems appear in this movie are because of that leadership void, right? The leadership void of Tony allows all of the bad things that happen, sometimes actually kind of causes them to happen.
That's great, Brian. And we're going to talk about that the rest of this episode. How do we counteract that? If we're in a spot in a certain facet of our life, or maybe even in our entire life, where we might be more like Tony, spoilers, I'll share a story like that at the end. What do we do to get out of that spot? So that's what we're going to talk about next, Brian. But first, the intro.
Hi, I'm Brian Nutwell.
I'm Drew Paroz.
And we are on a journey to become better leaders by touring fantastic worlds and inspiring lore by going on a wonder tour.
We connect leadership concepts to story contexts because it sticks to our brains better. You can find out more at WonderTourPodcast.com.
Or on YouTube. Okay, yeah, so if we have, I think without too much difficulty, established that Tony is nothing resembling a leader at the start of this movie and really isn't much of a leader even by the end. He successfully transitions from being self-centered schmuck to self-centered heroic figure. Who are our leadership examples in this movie? What does leadership look like in this Iron Man movie, and how does Tony break out of his "it's all about me" mindset? Is it just circumstances?
Well, I think like most of us, Tony breaks out because he has this experience that changes the way that he views the world. It changes his perspective of everything. And that experience obviously starts with his capture, as the movie frames it at the beginning, by these terrorists, and his in this cave for this month. But that in and of itself probably isn't enough for Tony to have this realization. Of course, he has the moment where he sees the Stark Industries logo on the missile next to him when he's lying on the ground, shocked. That's great, but there's more to the realization. The realization that what he has created is being used to do harm is not the full realization. I think for Tony, for him to become the kind of man that makes the sacrifice that he makes in the first Avengers movie, and of course in Endgame, there has to be a spark. And I would argue that that spark is Yinsen. Because in this, again, Brian, you set up beautifully that Tony's more of a Luke Skywalker. And when we see a Luke Skywalker type character who's not really a leader, more so a hero, what we want to look for is, as magnanimous leaders, where's the Obi-Wan?
Yeah, it's a time honored movie trope, but it's also a powerful thing in our actual lives, right? The person who is an example of a different way to be. So Tony's experience, as you say, sets him up to question a lot of his assumptions, right? What he thought he was doing with his life, what he thought the purpose of his technology was, and just to kind of opens his eyes to like what's it like to be on the other end. But then what do you do about it? How do you behave in the face of terrible things? How do you behave in the face of questioning your assumptions? Really, he only has this one sympathetic voice in the movie that gives him an opportunity to think about things in a different way. And Yinsen has some really great lines about purpose, but he also just by his basic actions, like takes care of this person that he doesn't know, saves his life, and then risked his own life to help him get out. Risked his own life. It would have been a lot easier for him to collaborate with the captors than to collaborate with Tony.
Oh, it's beautiful. Like you said, we could have chosen so many different moments to talk about here, but Yinsen, I mean, he has these quotes, right? He says, "So you're a man who has everything and nothing."
And he's talking about Tony doesn't have a family, right? He's not married, he doesn't have kids. He's lost his parents, as we find out later on, right? That's kind of the immediate context, but the real context is like you don't have a purpose, like you don't have any reason to be better than you are. You don't have any reason to do the things that you're doing. This really is at a moment where probably Tony needs to hear that, but that's also I think a thing that we can all be thinking about, like who are we doing things for? What is from where does our purpose derive? And that doesn't necessarily mean to be something spiritual. It's just like who are you taking care of? Like who is benefiting from your actions? And Yinsen really challenges him with that. And of course, in movie fashion, of course he is killed in the process of the first act of the movie here. But the reveal that like he didn't even have anything that he was going back to, right? It didn't necessarily change his, he sort of transferred his caring to Tony just as in context, like because that's who he was, that's how he's portrayed. But that's a lesson that Tony really needed to learn. He didn't have that example in his life. We don't have. He has lots of people caring for him, right? He's got Potts, he's got Happy, but he's got Rhodey who's sort of shepherding him around. But he doesn't have anybody that he respects, that he observes caring, that he wants to emulate until this point in the movie.
Yeah, it's a beautiful passing of the torch again, just like Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, where you have Obi-Wan making the sacrifice and Luke watching so that Obi-Wan dies so that Luke can escape, and he willingly makes the sacrifice. And of course, that moment ends up transforming both Darth Vader and also Luke. And it's only in the infinite wisdom of Obi-Wan that he could see that like it's not his fight at this point. He needs to be the one who stays in. And that's what we see with Yinsen. Yinsen said this was always the plan.
Right.
Yinsen is the wise man who can see beyond what the young, passionate, energetic, and again, lots of great traits that Tony has. But the traits that Yinsen has are the traits of an actual leader, of somebody who can make a difference in the world, versus Tony has a lot of power, but what is that power actually doing?
And so I think what we talked about a little bit in the pre-show, right? The arc of this story is Tony turning into a hero, right? The arc of the story is everything from self-centered Tony with the glass of scotch and the Hummer talking about the Maxim Cover Girls to Tony standing on the podium at the end saying, "I am Iron Man." Like,
Mm-hmm.
but in order to get to the "I am Iron Man," somewhere in the middle of this movie, he has to realize he can't be Tony anymore. He can't be that version of Tony Stark anymore. He's got to let some of those things go, or he's got to pick up some purpose to align to in order to get there. So, what does that look like? How do we do that? How do we examine ourselves to decide where we maybe need more purpose or need to alter the focus?
Well, I want to touch on one thing here that happens because a lot of this stuff feels like it, in my life, some of it just happens to you, where you get put into a crucible in one way or another, and that crucible then forms you. This seems to be a shared experience, hence why, books like The Crucible are extremely popular, and there is a like heavy motifs of refining
Hmm.
by fire, even if it's humans and not just metals, need to be refined by fire. There is concepts of, suffering is partly the point, because suffering and pain is, within reason at least, is how human beings are grown into the type of people who can be like Yinsen, who can
We
stand
have
in and make that sacrifice. And I have to call out this moment because I just am seeing it right now and it's beautiful. That the obvious point, the obvious mountaintop we could look at is on the way out when Yinsen says this was always the plan, and he runs in and he does the Leroy Jenkins and protects Iron Man so that he can escape. And then you have this emotion from Tony that he actually cared for this guy and he actually believed in the values that this guy believed in and he understood him. So it's easy to say that it's the moment is when Yinsen sacrifices himself and dies so that Tony can escape. But what if we look back at the previous moment when they come in there the day before and they're investigating him? Tony's over here saying that he's building the Jericho missile. And then Yinsen is defending him, even though Tony is refusing to tell Yinsen what's actually up most of the time up until this point. Yinsen also asks him, and Tony a lot of the time isn't even being fully transparent with Yinsen. But he holds the coal out and he's claiming that he's going to put the coal in Yinsen's mouth. And Yinsen, to Tony, that is terrible and he's squirming. And you see Yinsen there, and of course, that suffering is not lost on him, and yet he's willing to accept it.
right, yeah, and that's you're right. There's a moment there where Tony at least sticks his neck out for somebody else. He's like, no, 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 I need this guy. Like, oh yeah, he's a good assistant, right? That's kind of how he passes it off, right? But yeah, that's maybe the first time in the entire movie where we see him taking any action on behalf of anybody else.
Yeah, and it only happens because of Yinsen's character, and it's that character that we cultivate, that we put out into the world, that allows others to have the boldness to grow, where you put somebody else's growth before your own growth, like Yinsen does for Tony, that allows Tony to become the hero of the universe, basically.
Right. Yeah, and so we have all these fun, tech inversions, about the he starts with technology to that is just for killing people, right? And then he has to, out of self defense, build technology to keep himself alive. And then he sort of bootstraps that into, okay, what do I do with this now? Like, how do I benefit other people with technology, right? So it's a well laid out progression, right? It's a very satisfying, silly little comic book movie. But these are real things, right? These are real leadership challenges, and these are real problems that we all run into. Where is my purpose? Like, who am I helping? The thing that I'm working on, what is it actually going to do in the world? And have I spent even time thinking about that? We probably don't do that as often as we should.
Agreed. Agreed. We all have a bit to learn from the Yinsen, the Gandalf, the Obi-Wan. And I think it starts with making sure that we have those people in our lives and that we seek out those people. I have tremendous empathy for those that I come across that are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to have good character, and yet they've never had a mentor like that in their life. They've never had somebody who would bend over backwards for them. They've never had somebody who would put their development before that person's development. And of course, it starts with learning at the foot of somebody like that and ends with becoming somebody like that for others. And it's not a 1-2 step progression. In order to be able to do that, it is a lifelong finding your Obi-Wan and being an Obi-Wan to somebody else.
Maybe let's talk practical application. Like, what's a first step? What does that look like in your life to be able to, like, just kind of periodically re-examine your alignment, periodically re-examine your vision.
Yeah, so that's where I can bring in a good personal story here. In my life, so in my early 20s, mid 20s, like a lot of people do. Doesn't excuse it, but I kind of just went after the Tony Stark lifestyle. I can build things, I can be good at business, I can drive outcomes. And when I have free time, I can seek after the partying lifestyle. I can go and find things that give me immediate gratification. And so I did that for a handful of years. And I went off and honestly, I drifted from my purpose. I still had a semblance of an idea that I wanted to do good in the world and that what that looked like was helping others. But the most challenging part when you're in this constant cycle of just working yourself to death and then any free minute that you get trying to have as much fun as possible, kind of just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Eventually it wears you out, and if you're fortunate like I was, then maybe you're stuck up late in the middle of the night and you just can't go to sleep. You can't get the anxious thoughts out of your head, but they're driving you in a certain direction. That direction is, how are you actually helping people? If you are the type of person who would say that you believe that your mission is to help others so that they can have it better than you have it, what is the mechanisms by which you're doing that? What is the evidence that you're doing that? Because if you could, that was where I got to. I could not explain the evidence. I could not explain any mechanisms, and it caused great conflict in me. It was haunting me. I would truly say it was haunting me. And that realization that I'm not who I think I am. I think that's the same realization in a way of what Tony Stark is having, that he had this image of himself, that he was doing great things for the world through his innovation. And in reality, it was hardly innovation at all. It was just doing cool stuff and having a good time, which, if you can't explain how that's making a better world, then it's probably making a worse world.
Yeah, no, that's powerful, and I think I like the way you frame that as how can I explain it, not am I doing it right. Rigorous self honesty is desirable and really difficult, right? But thinking about it, trying to see yourself through the eyes of somebody else, and how would you explain it? Like if you had asked Tony Stark to explain to Rhodey in this movie, right, the Air Force sidekick that he just keeps sort of abusing and abasing throughout the course of the movie. If you asked him to think about how he looks through Rhodey's eyes, if you ask him to think about what are all the things that Pepper is doing to keep him like basically functional and fed and able to just go live in his little man cave and do his fun things. Like if he was able to think about that a little bit, he probably would view himself in a very different light. Like it would cause him to question some things, right? In movie fashion, he has a much more dramatic set of resetting his expectations. But I think any of us can do that. Like look at the people around you and how would those people say you are helping them? How would those people say you are benefiting the world? I think that would be really powerful, and could maybe challenge you to recalibrate your alignment a little bit.
Yeah, there's a quote from Socrates that's in some of Plato's writings. That's it. It's in when Socrates goes to the tribunal trial, whatever you want to call it, at
Mm-hmm.
least as the way Plato explains it, where Socrates is basically given the choice of stop practicing philosophy in the way that you're practicing it, or we will put you to death. And he has the moment where he pleads his case, or Plato pleads it for him. Again, this is all kind of confusing how this what actually happened here, but the point is that it's really useful wisdom that's being conveyed to us. And in this story about Socrates, he gives this kind of monologue, and in the end, his final words are, "A life not evaluated is not worth living."
Mm.
And his point is for me not to stop and think, not to practice philosophy in a way that challenges me, that challenges the world. That's a fate worse than death. So he chooses death because he says, I could go in his monologue. He says like, sure, I could go and I could go into live in a small town and be quiet or something like that. But that basically he sums it up by saying that would be a fate worse than death. And I'm assuming that most of you who listen to WonderTour are thinking that a life not evaluated, it's not worth living, though at times I've been guilty of it, as I explained, living a life that wasn't evaluated. And we all probably have, especially in just smaller facets of our life.
Yeah, no, it's the next decision is equally hard, right? Recognizing that you're not aligned with the purpose that you want, or recognizing that all of the habits you've built and all the structure you built of your life maybe didn't add up to the impact you wanted. Like the next step of deciding which pieces of that to blow up is really hard, and I've been experiencing that recently too. But 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 yeah, it's the only way out of that is through. The only way to do it is to first figure out what you want the purpose to look like, and what kind of leader you want to be, who are the people that you're trying to help, and then you can start to figure out what the steps are available to you.
All right, Brian. This has been great. We had some non-conventional takeaways here. We looked at Iron Man almost 100 episodes ago, more than 100 episodes ago on WonderTour in the audio podcast form. And I thought, wow, this movie, it's a Marvel movie. It's fairly linear. It's a classic hero's journey. And yet we found new ways to look at it. I just love going on that sort of a journey with you. So let's hit some key takeaways. So the key takeaway number one that we had is that you have to evaluate your own leadership traits. So we talked about this in the case of the practical application and how I had to evaluate where I was at and am I actually making an impact on the world? Am I actually a leader? And I think Tony had to go through the same journey in his experiences.
Yeah, and then that may require you to let go of some things that you were very attached to as parts of your personality or parts of your lifestyle. And of course, in the context of this movie, a lot of the conflict is that he's trying to force his organization to let go of some things, right? But that may be a real thing too. So I think we should definitely look for those opportunities and be aware of the scope of that difficulty. But just asking the question, that's the big one. And the other one too, of course, is just the other good takeaway is the power of the example, the power of the mentor, the power of the person who's there showing you what it looks like to do it the other way is difficult to overstate how much of an impact that can have on us. And we've all had some of those people who are like, oh, like, okay, yeah, that's better than the way I'm doing it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I met with one of those people yesterday, Brian, our friend Chabot, who, in a lot of ways, Chabot just does things on another level of what I am capable of doing. And every time I get to sit down with him and learn from him, it is an absolute joy, and it challenges me. So
Yeah,
yeah, having wise mentors, and if you don't have those right now, don't be discouraged. Reach out to people. Go to the types of places that those people are going to be at. The great thing, and we always say this on WonderTour, is wise mentors, they are very willing to mentor people who want to change, who want to be better, who want to make an impact. Be willing to go and ask those people to support you, even if you don't know them that well, because if you are earnestly seeking magnanimous character, more often than not, that person will find the time.
right. No, that's really cool. I like that. All right. Good discussion today. Thank you so much for this one. We will come back next time for episode 110, part two of the Iron Man story, and we'll talk a little bit about the implications of technology. We're kind of wrapping up our arc on humans and technology, and so we'll talk about what this movie has to tell us about what you should do with technology, as opposed to where Tony started with some things you maybe shouldn't. So, looking forward to that. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. In the meantime, just remember, as always, character is destiny.